If postmodernism has taught us anything, it has taught us the wisdom of the adage that both God and the devil reside in the details. We are today hypersensitive to the peril of offering generalizations that might compromise the ability to take full measure of the intricate minutiae that may be elicited by examining any particular phenomenon. As scholars, we must be mindful of the limits of our analytic categories, conceptual framings, and synthetic reconstructions. Indeed, not only is there a surplus of meaning in whatever we study, a superfluity for which we could never give an adequate reckoning, but the supplement may prove to be as essential as what we imagine to be essential, and thus the better part of valor should summon a sense of humility and uncertainty. Mysticism presents an additional challenge, insofar as the experience studied under this rubric are typically thought to be ineffable, impenetrable, and consequently difficult to classify and to analyze. Like many other scholars of my generation, I am inclined to shun positing a rigid and categorical definition of mysticism that would be applied unconditionally, insisting instead that this phenomenon, or perhaps more accurately, this complex of phenomena, should be treated as an encompassing worldview that always must be set within a given religious context. As Gershom Scholem famously argued in the opening lecture of his major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, quote, "There is no such thing as mysticism in the abstract. That is to say, a phenomenon or experience which has no particular relation to other religious phenomena. There is no mysticism as such. There is only the mysticism of a particular religious system, Christian, Islamic, Jewish, and so on." Scholem does not deny that there are common characteristics that are brought out through comparative analysis. His point, rather, is that there is no abstract mystical religion, and thus one must start from the recognition of plurality, that is, the mystical aspects as they take shape in different contexts. I would formulate the matter by appealing to the philosophical truism that plurality is discernible to the human brain only against the backdrop of uniformity, just as uniformity is discernible against the backdrop of plurality. The dialectical relation of difference and sameness precludes setting them in antithetical conflict. In my judgment, therefore, it is still theoretically warranted and heuristically viable to ponder the variant expressions of the mystical in different cultural settings by identifying patterns of thought and unified systems. I hasten to add that in my thinking, these patterns can be compared to DNA, which generates new molecular constellations in an apparently endless cycle of succession, what might be called an infinite genetic multiple, while the systems provide the relatively stable frameworks through and in which those changing patterns evolve, dissolve, and revolve. We are justified then in presuming that sameness is precisely what engenders difference. This factor validates the study of mysticism in a cross-cultural perspective. So what then does mysticism evoke? To borrow the locution of Maurice Blanchot, we can describe the mystical as the limit experience. That is, the experience of what is outside the whole when the whole excludes every outside. The experience of what is still to be attained when all is attained, and what is still to be known when all is known. The inaccessible, the unknown itself. The first thing to ask is, what does Blanchot mean when he speaks of that which is outside the whole when the whole excludes every outside? Would this not perforce be an outside that is outside the outside, the unknown and inaccessible, the increment that is more and therefore less than the totality? It should come as no surprise that Blanchot refers to this limit experience paradoxically as the experience of non-experience. The experience, quote, of thought thinking that which will not let itself be thought. Thought thinking more than it is able by an affirmation that affirms more than can be affirmed. The more itself is the experience affirming only by an excess of affirmation, and in this surplus affirming without anything being affirmed, finally affirming nothing. Along these lines, a number of scholars have proffered a taxonomy of mysticism as the yearning of consciousness to extend beyond the periphery of consciousness. Needless to say, the language appropriate to comprehending the incomprehensible is of a special sort. What may be called a verbal gesture of unsaying, or as academics like to refer to it, an apophatic utterance, an act of speaking that affirms more than it can affirm, affirming without having anything to affirm, and thus in the end affirming nothing, which is not to say no thing, that is the absence of presence, but the limit that is the excess, the excessive limit by which the excess is limited and the limit exceeded. Understanding mysticism as the expression of the inexpressible is flexible enough to satisfy both the essentialist contention that there is something we can identify as the unchanging essence of mysticism, and the constructivist opinion that the phenomenon always needs to be studied and evaluated within specific cultural contexts. The unthinkable will be unthought differently in each setting, and hence to construe matters in this light provides a hermeneutical model to account for both the commonality and distinctiveness of mystical experiences as they arise in multiple traditions. Cast in another terminological register, the amorphous or shapeless quality of the experience is precisely what justifies positing a universal dimension, even as I readily acknowledge that the latter must be determined continually by the constraints and possibilities imposed by the particular. In communicating to students the value of a comparative approach that is nonetheless respectful of the constructivist argument, I routinely emphasize that by digging into the soil of one tradition, we invariably find the pathways that lead to other traditions. It is in this sense that mysticism can be designated a radical thinking, an eradication, an uprooting that is at the same time taking hold of the root. We ask again, what can we say about the nature of the mystical? A common element that recurs in scholarly attempts to delineate mysticism is the emphasis placed on the immediate consciousness of what is assumed to be the absolute ground of all being. The ground alluded to by mystics is not subject to the critique of ontological substantialism or metaphysical essentialism. Since mystics have construed this ground metaphorically as the plenitudinal vacuum, the void swarming with the fullness of being's nothingness, the intrinsic reality that intrinsically lacks reality, the ultimate emptiness that is itself empty, the space of non-locality that resists the reification of nothing as something or of something as nothing. In monotheistic religions, like Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, that inessential essence, that is the essence whose essence consists of having no essence, since what it is what it shall become, that essence is customarily identified as the personal deity of the scriptural narrative, the God of creation, revelation, and redemption. And thus mysticism is demarcated as the intense and direct encounter with the divine presence. St. Thomas Aquinas famously spoke of the cognitio Dei experimentalis, that is the knowledge of God through experience, an idea inspired exegetically by the verse in Psalms, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." Sufi masters in the Islamic tradition have similarly characterized the immediacy of mystical experience as a form of tasting, thaq in Arabic. And Kabbalists were wont to speak of it as an enlightenment that comes by way of sucking, derech yinika. These formulations, and others that could have been mentioned, are meant to impart that one who is mystically enlightened apprehends an esoteric sagacity unavailable by ordinary means of perception and intellection, a gnosis that is not cognitive but intuitive, a flash of insight that spontaneously illumines the dark night of the soul. And yet, even for the wise of heart, as mystics are often called, The mysteries are not elucidated transparently by the illumination, but rather they are rendered even more mysterious. Something of the secret lingers in the very diffusion of the secret. The Christian dogma of the Incarnation and Trinity demonstrate the point. To grasp these principles of faith is not to resolve the paradox of the divine being born immaculately in a human body, or the paradox of the triune God, the one that is three. On the contrary, the incarnational and Trinitarian beliefs are predicated on holding the paradox in place. As another illustration, let me mention a secret that many scholars have singled as one of the characteristic doctrines of medieval Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, the mystery of the androgyne, or the belief that God possesses both masculine and feminine qualities, respectively the attributes of love and judgment, or the potency to overflow and the capacity to receive. To ascertain this teaching is not to put an end to the wonder of the mystery. In fact, contemplating the matter opens the mystery to its deeper depths as mystery. For what is it, after all, to say that the faith in the one God of Judaism involves comprehension of an experiential participation in the sacred union of the king and matrona, the bridegroom and the bride? From the mystical vantage point, transmission of the secret protects the secrecy of the secret. Indeed, the very exposure of the secret amplifies its occlusion. The dissemination safeguards its withholding. This is the case for both the mystic and the historian studying mysticism. What is revealed is a truth that cannot be revealed except through a veil. Many mystics speak of the goal as seeing through the veil. But to see through the veil is not to dispose of the veil. It is to see that there is no seeing without a veil. And in this seeing, the mind lets go of the fanciful urge to posit a face beyond the veil. The veiling of the veil, and not some truth that stands naked behind the veil, is what is finally unveiled. Alternatively expressed, mystical vision consists of discerning that there is no face that is not itself a mask. Many scholars have identified the definitive unmasking, the quintessential secret of mysticism, as the merging of the finite with the infinite, the dissolution of the individuated self and its assimilation into the one whence all beings emerge and whither they shall return. The experience of unio mystica has far-reaching implications for gauging the potential of the human predicament. But here I want to focus on one issue that is most pertinent to the topic of this lecture series. In the monistic state of non-dual or transcendental consciousness, if indeed it can still be called a state, opposites coincide. Since within the infinite, there can be no discrimination. A succinct and relatively lucid formulation of this idea is found in the following passage from the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, which is the major anthology of Kabbalistic teachings that began to circulate in the 13th and 14th centuries in northern Spain in fragmentary units, and then through an extensive period of redaction and editing, it was finally published in the 16th century. So this is the passage. Rabbi Isaac said, "When the Holy One, blessed be He, created the world and wanted to reveal the depth of hiddenness and light from within darkness, they were contained one within the other. All things were contained one within the other. Good and evil, right and left, Israel and the nations, white and black. All things were dependent on one another." The goal of the contemplative life, according to the Kabbalists, is to ascend mentally to this plane, the moment before the separation of the infinite one into a duality. And within which the opposites coalesce. The mystical adept who has reached this place, that is no place, according to the turn of phrase in another Zoharic passage, has clearly traversed the dichotomies that regulate what Husserl labeled the natural attitude, that is, the common distinctions that are necessary for us to structure our way of being in the world coherently. The moral distinction between good and evil, the spatial distinction between right and left, the cultural distinction between different ethno-religious groups, and the perceptual distinction between white and black. All of these distinctions dissolve in the oneness of infinity. The standard disparity between permissible and prohibited, which is basic to the ritual fabric of any religious tradition, would be rendered problematic for the mind assimilated into the boundlessness that transcends all polarity. And to follow the logic to its conclusion, if the boundary that separates holy and profane is obliterated, then the life of piety engendered thereby could justify forms of behavior that ostensibly contradict what the law dictates. Extremes that can be manifest either as the intemperate indulgence in or as the austere withdrawal from the sensual. On this reading, as some scholars have argued, mysticism inevitably fosters an antinomianism, for the laws are repudiated and not just transcended. In my own work, I have preferred to refer to this facet of mysticism as hypernomianism, a change in terminology that intimates that the mystic does not break the law as such, but actually fulfills the law by extending beyond its limits. From the non-dual or monistic perspective, the very purpose of the law is to attain the degree of holiness in which there is no more distinction between holy and unholy, where righteous and transgressive behavior are no longer differentiated. To paraphrase the language of Paul in Romans 6:14, sin does not apply to a person who is no longer under the law. Or as he put it in Romans 14:14, Jesus had convinced him that there is nothing unclean of itself. Perhaps even more germane are the related statements in the Pseudo-Pauline epistle to Titus 1:15, to the pure all things are pure, and in 1 John 3:9, whoever is born of God does not sin. The original intent of these dicta notwithstanding, it is easy to see how they could have been, as they were, interpreted in a hypernomian fashion. Rumi, the great Persian mystic of the 13th century, wrote in one of his poems, "I will fare as far as the meeting place of the two seas." With these words, based on the description of Moses in the Quran, he conveyed that the mystic journey is a search for the spot where opposites are identical, the convergence of light and dark, past and future, ephemeral and eternal. Rumi affirmed what Nicholas of Cusa, the Renaissance polymath, later referred to as the coincidentia oppositorum. The epistemological shift occasioned by the mystical excursion, accordingly, is called in the Sufi tradition a seeing of two eyes. That is a double vision, by which one discerns that opposites are not oppositional, or in the felicitous and perhaps even more paradoxical language of Kerouac, opposites are not the same for the same reason they are the same. The hypernomian stretching of the limit was expressed succinctly in another verse by Rumi. The man of God is beyond infidelity and religion. To the man of God, right and wrong are alike. The same sentiment underlies the following astonishing remark made by the 13th century Castilian Kabbalist Azrael of Gerona in response to the hypothetical query regarding the possibility of God creating something out of nothing. This is what he wrote. The one who brings forth something out of nothing is not depleted, for the something is in the nothing in the manner of the nothing, and the nothing is in the something in the manner of something. The Creator is the principle of identity for every way of faith and way of heresy, for they are identical in the place of the conjunction of his nothing in his something. That God should be identified as the root of faith and heresy is not shocking. Indeed, in a strictly monotheistic system, how could it be otherwise? But what is so provocative about this statement is the assertion that in the Creator, the way of faith and the way of heresy are equal. How can this be? Clearly, this presents a challenge to the normative assumption that the heretic is one lacking in faith. But the dyad collapses in the mystical awareness that there is no binary distinction in the indifferent or equanimous unity of the infinite. A phrase employed by the Kabbalists to proclaim this idea is Shnei hafachim b'noseh echad, two opposites in one subject, an idea that obviously assaults the Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction, which states that for any proposition, P and not P cannot both be true concomitantly. But this is precisely the truth advanced by the Kabbalists. From the standpoint of infinity, a thing is both good and evil, holy and unholy, because it is neither good nor evil, neither holy nor unholy. On what basis can a particular belief or action be condemned or condoned? The nomian and moral strictures would dissipate for the individual who experiences the concatenation of being through the filter of this radical monism. But can such a mystical vision be implemented sociologically without tearing the very fabric of the religion that facilitated the vision? I will share with you one forceful expression of this concern offered by Chaim of Volozhin, a leading figure of the Lithuanian rabbinic society in the second half of the 18th century, and a dogged opponent of Hasidism, the ecstatic pietistic movement that flourished at the same time in Eastern Europe. In his treatise Nefesh HaChaim, The Soul of Life, Rabbi Chaim distinguished two modalities of truth, the absolute and the relative. According to the former, which can be apprehended only from the perspective of the essence of God, there is nothing but simple unity or complete indifference in which there are no temporal or spatial divisions. From the human perspective, this truth must be concealed, for if it were fully revealed, it would destroy the axiological foundation upon which society is built. Significantly, Rabbi Chaim does not deny the veracity of the monistic perspective. He merely says that it cannot be materialized in this world, and thus the relativity of truth prevails. Despite Rabbi Chaim's reservations and the epistemological strategy he puts forward to avoid the obliteration of the ontological boundaries critical to shielding the distinctiveness of Judaism, a plethora of sources that span many centuries attest to the centrality of the hypernomian in the Jewish mystical tradition, although by linking its full realization to the Messianic era, the goal is perpetually deferred. For our purposes, I will mention one example from Abraham Isaac Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Palestine from 1921 until his death in 1935. In a passage from his voluminous corpus, he describes mystics as the great men whose spirit is so sublime to the point that from their perspective, if the entire world were in their situation, the commandments would be nullified, as it will be in the future to come, in the days of Messiah. Drawing on an earlier Talmudic statement attributed to Rabbi Joseph that the commandments would be nullified in the future, Kook avows that the elevated soul proleptically realizes the perfection to be fully displayed in the end, and thus for such a person, the ritual laws are already ineffectual, if not in practice, at least in theory. As he puts it in another passage, with regard to the supernal divine truth, there is no difference at all between conceived belief and heresy. That same theme again. Neither of them offers the truth, but faith brings one close to truth and heresy to deceit, and as a result, good and evil ensue from these opposites. The world in its entirety, with all its spiritual and material values, is in relation to our assessment. And in relation to our assessment, truth is revealed in faith, which is the source of good, and deceit and heresy, which is the source of evil. However, in relation to the light of the infinite, everything is equal. Heresy, too, is a disclosure of the force of life, for the light of life of the supernal splendor is garbed within it, and consequently, spiritual warriors gather very good sparks from it. From our relative standpoint, it is prudent to distinguish belief in heresy and the good and evil derived therefrom. But from the absolute standpoint, the two are indistinguishable. Darkness is itself perceived to be a manifestation of light, which I think is a key to this room. And hence the magnanimous soul can descend into the depths of darkness to gather the sparks of light imprisoned therein. To realize this truth, which surpasses the conventional distinction between truth and untruth, one must walk the path that leads beyond the path of lawfulness, not necessarily by breaking the law, but by fulfilling the inscription of its erasure. Ironically, it is the outlaw who complies meticulously to the law, to the extent that insubordination itself is a form of obedience. My painstaking study of Jewish mysticism these past decades has sensitized me to a larger issue in the investigation of mysticism. On the one hand, the intrinsic vocation of the Jewish mystic is tagged as the ability to acquire gnosis of and to be integrated within the non-differentiated essence. But on the other hand, in that very essence, opposites are no longer distinguishable. Whence it would follow that the schism between Jew and non-Jew would be subject to subversion. The mystical impulse cultivated by Kabbalists allows us to speak of a universal singularity. That is, a universal effacing of boundaries that is nevertheless the singular dispensation of one ethnic faction to execute. Here we touch upon what I deem to be an intractable incongruity of the messianic promise as it has been refracted through the prism of the mystical teaching in Judaism. The identity of difference is apperceived through the speculum of the difference of identity. This casts a spotlight on the blind spot in the system on the whole, a non-egocentrist philosophy that is concurrently ethnocentric. The mystical quest for the underlying interconnectivity through which all things are linked should problematize the divisiveness that is implied by the claim of uniqueness. And yet, the paradox is that the Jew undermines the gap separating Jew and non-Jew by steadfastly upholding the gap separating Jew and non-Jew. What does the particular case of Jewish mysticism teach us about the lot of humanity more generally? It is no secret that even in our predominantly secular society, the power of religion persists in our national consciousness and political discourse. Atheism and agnosticism surely are to be tolerated and even defended constitutionally. But one wonders if a person who did not explicitly profess belief in God, let alone someone who openly denied or expressed doubt about the existence of God, could stand a chance of running for the presidency. Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the seventh and presumably last master of the Chabad Lubavitch dynasty, a Russian Hasidic sect that reestablished its headquarters in Brooklyn during the Second World War, was fond of noting in the last decades of his life that the superpower status of America is directly related to the fact that it is distinguished among all modern nations in placing exceptional emphasis on faith and conviction in God, a propensity, he said, exemplified in the slogan, "In God We Trust," which is connected especially to the nation's currency. In sync with the reversal of logic typical for Chabad, the location of this expression of trust in God on something as materialistic as money signifies the need to transpose the material into its higher spiritual destiny, to rectify the material through the material. Be that as it may, the crucial point is that Schneerson astutely perceived that the American psyche is still very much beholden to the legacy of its spiritual past. The cardinal principle of separation of church from state is itself an expression of a deep-seated religious, we might even say mystical fervor, fueled by the utopian vision e pluribus unum, from many one. But what does this mean? Does this denote an effacement of difference such that all people eventually will worship in the same way, akin to the prophetic pronouncement, "For then I will make the nations pure of speech so that they will invoke the Lord by name and serve him with one accord"? Do we desire a homogeneous society in which we are all clones of an allegedly perfect paradigm? Is the possibility of a unified humanity dependent on the various religions superseding the way they are practiced today and adopting something akin to an interconfessionalism? Does the ideal of universal redemption necessitate doing away with disparate modes of faith and their respective liturgical and ceremonial rites? Or does the ideal of from many one signify a heterogeneity that stimulates difference, a unity in difference, such that the distinct forms of observance will be secured? Mystical acuity advocates a state of enhanced spiritual consciousness characterized as the discernment of the underlying unity of all things. But the postmodern appreciation of the interrelatedness of all things, or what Einstein called the unified field theory, does not imply the absorption of all difference in an all-encompassing identity, the undifferentiated and disembodied one. What is at stake, rather, is the perception of the oneness embodied in the multiplicity of existence at large, a one that is constantly being configured by the manifold. In this sense, we can surely endorse the idiom "spirit matters." Physiologically speaking, what is most impressive is the singularity and unpredictability of individual cells. Every cell in a body may have the same DNA, which carries the information needed to make protein molecules, but the genetic variation consists in which proteins are made. From this rudimentary example, we can conclude that already encoded at the cellular level is differentiation. The same characteristic is observable at a more advanced level in the evolutionary chain. Thus, for instance, scans of the brain indicate convincingly that no two people react in an exactly identical manner when viewing or imagining a duplicate image. There's always variation. It goes without saying that we must ascribe this characteristic to the highest of human endeavors in the domain of the spiritual as well. I propose that the scientific data coincides with what mystics have been articulating for centuries, specifically with the penchant to trespass the very limits that delimit its nature. Mysticism can serve as a good vehicle to enunciate a spirituality that embraces the universal and the particular dialectically, so that it is meaningless to imagine the one in the absence of the other. Indeed, if we attend carefully to the voice of mystics that have reverberated through history, we can fathom the supreme secret that the universal is not only achieved through the agency of the particular, but its very instantiation preserves the particularity. Simply put, oneness entails multiplicity, universality fosters singularity. When the theological knowledge is translated anthropologically, we can say that ethnocentrism is, as the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas taught, the condition that secures the viability of a genuine alterity, since the notion of an absolutely universal, the principle that grounds the sense of respect for and responsibility towards the irreducible other, can be served only through the particularity of each people. Otherness is what makes the other the same. What I share with the other is that we are different. This, I submit, is the great achievement of mystics as well. Visionaries who have sought from time immemorial to transform the very traditions that have transformed them, by simultaneously sustaining and surpassing the specificity of their upbringing. On this score, mysticism can be branded the path that leads away from the path, That is, a path that is both paved and subverted by the very traversing of the path. The final station on the path may very well be to venture beyond the path, but to undergo such an adventure, the code of the road, as it were, requires one to travel the path continuously.